Thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure to lead off the afternoon session talking about how Newmont is implementing a shadow cost of carbon. First off, I'd like to make a full disclosure that I am the lowest person on the global energy and climate team, so I got the honor to travel to Toronto for my first time and give this talk for the rest of the team. So some of you may have recalled Mike Eyre has given talks for energy and mines in the past, and he regrets he couldn't come, but I'm happy to come in his stead. Let's see, is it the red button? Okay, so the Global Energy and Climate Team, along with all of our regions, looks at a variety of ways to reduce the cost of energy within Newmont. And obviously, any new project, any sustaining projects are continually looking at how do we reduce some of the fixed costs for our operations. So the global strategy does not just include renewables, as we've heard a lot about this morning, but also continues to look at how do we improve our ongoing operations, how do we improve the cost of energy that we're receiving from, say, grid suppliers. So our supply chain group is working continually to renegotiate contracts and achieve the best cost for us per kilowatt hour in our operations. But renewable energy, as we've heard today, is starting to emerge as a potential option, and I'll talk about how the cost of carbon is helping us to consider that option. But for the most part, we're also looking at how do we reduce our carbon footprint. And so a lot of our power has traditionally been generated by coal around the world, and in fact, in Nevada, it's still a large part of our energy production. And so fuel switching, as we've heard, is probably one of the most important options that everyone is looking at in the near term, looking at perhaps the use of liquid natural gas as an alternative to diesel or to coal. The Global Energy and Climate Team is also considering climate adaptation, and so that looks at continuity of operations and how are we going to respond to climate change in the future. So today I'll be talking about how we've achieved an internal cost of carbon that we're using in our planning process. How do we use that in our planning processes as projects go forward? And then I'll talk about also how we look at reduction of our overall greenhouse gas footprint across the world. Oops. So in considering an internal carbon price, we need to think about what's happening around the world. Let's see, I think I may have, no, okay. And so looking at the Paris Accord, looking at the International Council on Mining and Metals and their statement about how the mining industry would deal with global climate change, with greenhouse gas emissions, we want to come into line with those. So we have established a policy and strategy for predicting how carbon is going to impact new operations and potentially continuing brownfield operations when there's a certain threshold limit. The way that we factor this in is in the early planning process where we're still looking at options. And so within the Newmont scheme, we have what's called a stage gate process. And at stage 2A, we're evaluating all options. And so it's been determined that we will look at the cost of carbon at that stage when we can consider what are the variety of ways that we can provide energy for a new operation or an expansion of an operation. So we're hoping that this internal cost of carbon, where we don't already face that challenge, and of course in some countries like Australia, we have faced a carbon tax in the past, can we use that to spur innovation, to spur investment that we wouldn't normally do by factoring in that shadow cost of carbon? And what you can see here is our newest mine to go operational. That's the Long Canyon mine near Wells, Nevada. Declared commercial production just a few days ago. And that's going to be the first large project that's going to consider this internal cost of carbon. So in the United States, with the recent election, it's questionable right now how much we're going to have to consider a cost of carbon. In fact, within just a few days, there's been a lot of pushback saying we need to wait and see. But the fact that we operate in a lot of different countries means that we need to consider, for example, cost of carbon that we know is coming again in Australia. Even in the United States and Nevada, there has been some regulation, some caps, some levels that we've had to deal with already. And then we have other countries like Peru where we know that they have been already talking about imposing a cost of carbon. So that global reach means that we can't ignore it in some countries, and as a global corporation, we need to factor that into our long-term thinking. So someone mentioned today earlier that we need to consider energy production for 25 to 30 years, and I think that within Newmont, it's safe to say that we actually do think about that, both when we're negotiating current contracts and when we're thinking about alternatives for our new operations that will come online 10 to 15 years from now. And we have to deal with all the different varieties and schemes for carbon, whether they're taxes, offsets, credits, renewable portfolio standards. So we can't just think in one box, we've got to be thinking globally again. And I think that's an advantage, particularly for those of us working in the United States, that we can consider that because we're going to embrace all of these, that it may not happen tomorrow, but in the future, we'll be prepared for dealing with whatever happens in the United States. So how did we establish a price for carbon? And of course, one of the first things that most of us do is we go out and benchmark. We look at what is the mining sector declaring, and a number of our collegial companies have already considered this. We heard earlier from Barrick. We heard from a number of the miners. And so a lot of those companies have already established internal costs of carbon. And so within the mining sector, that range is between $18 and $40 per ton. We know already from our experience in Australia between 2012 and 2014 that we faced a tax that averaged $23.58 Australian. So that puts this range into a reality. And we've also looked at maybe some of the companies that are mining at a much larger scale than Newmont does, companies like BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto, for example. BHP Billiton has estimated that a global price for carbon should be somewhere in the range of $24 to $50 a ton. The Paris Climate Accord suggests that there may be a price that ranges around $24 a ton in order to meet the 2 degrees centigrade threshold. That may be too low, and so $50 a ton may actually spur innovation to help us get to that very significant goal. So within Newmont, we're recommending a price between $25 and $50 a ton for carbon for any investment that will emit more than 25,000 tons of CO2. And you may ask, well, how do you use that range? And I'll show you in a few minutes how we do that. But basically, we bound the problem between the 25 and the 50, and then we look at what does that cost of carbon allow us in terms of investment that may include renewables. Here you see at the bottom just some of the other benchmarks. So if you look at companies much larger than us, say, for example, Vale, they're using a price of $50 a ton. Barrick, who's the world's largest gold producer, we're number 2, the Avis of gold mining, if you will, is using a cost of $24 a ton. And then you can see a lot of the smaller producers are using costs of carbon that are lower. And that may have to do with the grade that they're mining. It may have to do with their process. So again, we think that number between $25 and $50 a ton is quite realistic. So another thing that we've implemented within our planning process is what we call a break-even cost of carbon. So this is saying, assuming that the price of carbon can grow to wherever it needs to go, at what point does the net present value for an energy investment go to zero, in which case it becomes valueless. And so most of our power on site is generated by diesel gensets. So in the case where we don't make any changes to how we utilize energy or the source of our energy, we've estimated a break-even cost of carbon of $225 a ton. If we start considering alternative energy sources like solar hybrid solutions of various sizes, and notice this is for Tanami. Some of you may have seen our sustainability and external relations report called Beyond the Mine. There's some discrete examples of the Tanami mine, which is a remote north central Australian mine. It's completely off the grid, and so we're looking, because we know that there is a ceiling that's been imposed and that will likely pay for expansions as we grow that mine, what are our options there? So if we start considering solar hybrid solutions, then you can see, depending on the size of plant, that break-even cost of carbon in the case of a 10 megawatt plant goes to 256, and for a 15 megawatt plant to $273 per ton. It's interesting that if you do the subtraction there, it's around that $25 to $50 range again. And so that gives you an idea of what can you buy between the difference if you're using $25 or $50 a ton. So you can see you can expand the solar option considerably if you're paying $50 a ton. So another thing that we're doing is we're doing, of course, long-range scenario planning, saying, okay, we know what the Paris Accord requires. We know what the science-based target for achieving zero emissions might be, which nobody thinks is really a viable solution. And we can look at what is our current usage. This is actually our baseline from 2013. If you want to see those numbers, you can again find them in our Beyond the Mine report. But you can see some of the different scenarios we're looking at. So again, 2013, which is what we're using as our baseline. This energy intensity is about 0.8, so it's millions of tons of CO2 per ounce of gold equivalent. That number looks wrong. I believe it's tons of CO2 per ounce of gold. And so we're looking at where do we need to be by 2030? Where do we need to be by 2050? You can see from this particular scenario is that we're not planning to try to achieve that zero greenhouse gas emissions target. But you can see that there are a variety of ways that we can either get to or exceed the 2030 goal for the mining industry. And so you can see some of the different scenarios considered here. For example, if we completely phase out the use of coal in our power plants, we did divest of our mine in Indonesia recently, so that's a big chunk of our carbon emissions from that coal-fired mine. We are still producing a lot of our power again in Nevada from coal, so eliminating or switching the fuel source for that power plant would give us some very significant reductions. You can see this yellow line. Again, this is looking at other fuel switching operations across various mine sites. One of the things that's being looked at Tanami right now is, can we switch from diesel-fired gensets to natural gas? There are some challenges for that because we would either need to truck natural gas to site, or we would need to invest or partner in a liquid natural gas pipeline to the mine. That actually is looking like a potentially promising solution, and that a lot of those choices help us make significant big steps in reducing our carbon footprint right away. Another thing that's being considered is increasing the amount of underground mining that we're doing. So there's a lot of excess rock that ends up being mined and moved when we look at our open pit operations. So just by starting to look more closely at, can we move some of our operations underground? Initially, there's a lot more capital expenditure to do that, but ultimately we move less rock and we can reduce the overall costs and energy consumption to do that mining. So I'm going to quickly talk about two particular case studies where we've already started to look at this internal shadow cost of carbon and show you how it potentially can benefit different alternatives to the fuel sources that we're currently using. The first one is the TS power plant in Nevada. Again, it's a coal-fired power plant that produces about 50% of our net energy requirements for Nevada operations, located near Reno. So even before we have incorporated this cost of carbon, we've been looking at the potential to switch this to natural gas. And you can see here, if there is no shadow cost of carbon, then switching to natural gas is a $50 million investment that the only thing it does for us is it reduces our greenhouse gas emissions. It's a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but as far as the bottom line goes, it doesn't really give us anything. So when you start factoring in an internal cost of carbon, if it's $25 per ton of carbon emitted, then you can see that this project goes to a net positive of $117 million. And if you use $50 per ton, then it becomes even better, almost $285 million net present value. So an internal cost of carbon, which, as you've seen from the global environment, is probably realistic in the long term, really has a benefit to force investment in directions that are going to reduce our overall global footprint and also help us to become more energy efficient and potentially consider alternative energy sources. So the Long Canyon example is very new. You saw the picture of the initial open pit. Again, that mine just went commercial earlier this month. And so what you see are magnitude of dollars here. There are no actual dollars yet calculated, but I think we can already, from the TS power plant example, get an idea of different energy sources that we might use. And we're starting to incorporate renewables into this equation. So right now we generate all of our power on site from diesel gensets. We'd like to change that. In fact, we think it's essential to move forward with phase 2 of Long Canyon. And so that the most likely fuel switching alternative is going to be to switch to natural gas. That does require extension of a pipeline 25 miles from its current termination. There's also the opportunity to purchase power from the grid, but that requires 50 miles of transmission lines added to existing towers. I was talking to someone earlier today that they've been working with the Wells Rural Electrical Co-op to provide solar power to that particular cooperative. And so that could give us immediately, once we make that investment, the ability to take advantage of that alternative source of power. But if you start looking at, again, using this range of costs of carbon, then you can see that we have a cost that we know pretty much what that is for diesel gensets. We know what the cost savings ultimately would be if we went to natural gas. We know the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that will result from that change. We're starting to look at this grid power alternative. This gives us the options to buy power in different blends from the grid. And I might point out that this is one of the few places in the world that we operate where we actually have this option. Virtually all of our other sites don't have the option to get onto the grid, except in Nevada. So our operations in Ghana, Peru, and Australia all are fairly remote and would require, would make this grid power alternative really much more difficult to achieve. And then finally, considering a hybrid solution. And actually for Long Canyon, it's still very early to say whether this has any potential, but we know at Tanami, a thermal solar alternative is looking very positive. And in fact, Newmont will be working with ARENA in a workshop that's going to be held in the next few months to look at how can we make that happen at the Tanami mine. So that's a quick overview of how we're incorporating the shadow cost of carbon, which in some cases I think is a real cost of carbon, into our planning process. You can see that it can actually push some alternatives over the line, if you will, to make them viable alternatives. And I think that's really the value for Newmont as a global corporation, is that we're looking forward to, in some cases, near term. In Australia, we expect that in a year or two, there's going to be a very real cost to the carbon we emit. And then in other countries where we anticipate it's coming, and then in some countries like my own, where it may be 4 years before we see it again, that we'll be prepared for that. And I think that's very important in the mining industry, that we start to think about the future and how do we reduce our footprint and the cost of energy production. So, thank you very much.